Welcome back everybody to the Hybrix cultivation system. Today we're going to be talking about selecting the right genetics. This is a slightly shorter lesson than usual. We're not going to dive really into detail about genetics, but we wanted to cover it in its own lesson because genetics can really determine your success. Recall how our first lesson was about the 4 elements. I would actually consider genetics to be the 5th element. This is another element that doesn't really fit into those 4, but is almost just as crucial. And we're also going to be focusing a little bit more on cannabis for this particular lesson, cannabis genetics, although the general principles are still relevant to vegetable growing as well. So, what we'll cover in this lesson is the importance of genetics. Why are genetics of your plants so important? We'll talk about genotypes and phenotypes and what those things mean and the differences between them. Then we'll compare seeds versus starts versus clones and tissue culture as methods for getting your genetics. We'll talk about some of the considerations specifically for Hybrix growing, since when people who are focusing on Hybrix are going to make slightly different decisions about their genetics than people growing with hydro or conventional methods. And we'll talk a little bit how to test for the quality of your genetics. Alright, so why care about genetics? Well, really, genetics can make or break your garden or grow for a number of reasons. I would say the biggest reason is what you can see here. So these are pictures from a commercial CBD hemp grow in Colorado that I visited, and at first glance you look at these plants and you might think, oh, well, there's a little nutrient deficiency going on because they're yellowing. But then when you get down and look at the roots of the plants, you'll see that they had a major fungal disease problem at the root of the plants. And this is a really common problem, especially for clones brought in from a different operation. They sometimes and oftentimes carry disease with them. And this can be disastrous for your grow. Most people, when they get a chronic disease like this, they just have to clean everything out and start completely from scratch, and it's hugely expensive. So this is just one of the reasons, and one of the more crucial reasons why it's really important to source your genetics properly, know where they're coming from, and to really consider carefully how you want to source your genetics. And this can apply to a garden just as much as to a cannabis grow. You can bring fungal diseases and pests into your garden with clones or even starts from outside. So another reason to care about genetics is when you're thinking about what variety of plant you want to grow. So as an example here with tomatoes, you might think, oh, I want to grow tomatoes. But what type of tomato do you want? What flavor of tomato do you want? Do you want it to be sweet? Do you want it to be more savory? Do you want small tomatoes, large tomatoes? Do you want a different color of tomato? As you can see, there's many different varieties of tomato, and most plants actually have many different varieties. Here's a similar example with cannabis. There are so many different flavors and terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles that you can get from various cultivars of cannabis. So you want to know what characteristics do you want for yourself, which ones do you enjoy the most, or if you're growing for the market, what is your local market looking for? What is the market that you're going to sell into prefer? That could be a consideration for you. You may want to go against the grain and introduce something that's going to be new to people and differentiate yourself that way. But either way, which variety of plant you're growing is going to be an important consideration. Here's another point that a lot of people don't take into consideration when they're thinking about genetics, but your environment, or more specifically your climate or your biome. That's the climate of the region where you are growing. And if you're growing indoors, you're going to be creating your own biome. Biomes and climates are determined really just by how hot or cold they are and how wet or dry they are. And you get a number of different climates just from those 2 parameters, as you can see here. So if you're growing indoors, you can choose to create whatever climate makes the most sense for you and for what you're growing. If you're growing outdoors, you have to adjust and adapt to the climate that you're growing in. Now, probably most people here are going to be growing in some sort of temperate climate, most likely either a forest or grassland or chaparral. That's also called the Mediterranean climate, which is common on the coast of California. Some of you might be growing farther north in Canada, boreal forest, but largely where most people are living, we don't have these extremes of climates like desert or tundra. Now, your genetics can influence the climate that you're growing in. In other words, you're going to want to select plants and perhaps cultivars of plants that are better suited for your climate and your environment. But actually, it can go the other way as well. This is what a lot of people don't realize, is that climate can actually influence genetics. In other words, the genetics of a plant can change and evolve based on the climate. In cannabis growing especially, I think this is a really underappreciated aspect, is matching your genetics with your environment. There are some cultivars that are just better suited to grow in a certain environment. For example, OG strains. If you don't know, OG actually stands for ocean grown. And it was given that name because those strains do best in an oceanside climate like that of Northern California, the Humboldt region. That's why that strain was named OG in the first place, to actually designate it as being more appropriate for that climate. If you listen to Kevin Jodry's talk on the Science of Cannabinoid Cultivation Academy, he talks about this. He talks about how there are particular strains that are more suited to the climate of a place like Grass Valley, which is another big cannabis growing region in California. There's going to be cultivars that are more suited to growing in Colorado, or growing in Michigan, or Maine, or wherever you are. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information out there readily, say on the internet and in public domain, that informs people about which genetics are best for which climates, but a lot of breeders will have an idea of this, and so talk to your breeder about the genetics matching the climate. Especially someone like Kevin Jodry is going to know that kind of thing. And so this gets into the difference between genotypes and phenotypes. Genotypes are literally the genetics of the plant. They're the genetic code found in the individual cell of the plant. Another word for the genotype is the cultivar. So this is literally the genetics of the plant. Phenotype, on the other hand, is the expression of the genetics, the expression of the genotype that is observed. So these are the physical characteristics of the plant. For example, let's say leaf size and leaf shape. Your genetics may say that the plant is supposed to have a short and fat leaf, but the phenotypical expression of that plant may end up varying a little bit. That leaf shape and size may change, especially if you have two sibling plants. They may have slightly different expressions of those genetics. And this is what's actually called a plant's epigenetics, because what's happening is it's the genetics interacting with the environment that is causing these differences. That's the concept of epigenetics. And so again, environment and really our four elements that we talk about are integral to consider with the genetics. Another term to understand, especially for cannabis growing and for even growing flowers, is chemotype, or sometimes referred to as the chemovar. And this is the difference in the composition of the secondary metabolites. So that's the terpenes and the cannabinoids and the flavonoids. These are secondary metabolites. These are the elements that give the plant its flavor and its quality. And in the case of cannabis, they also influence the quality of the high. This also is the difference between a high THC plant and a high CBD plant. And it's interesting to note that minor genetic and epigenetic changes may produce large changes in the chemotype. And this can actually happen rather quickly. So here are just some examples of different cannabis phenotypes. This is how the plant, we've got different cultivars here, but also you can see how the plant is expressing its genetics in a way that gives the plant its unique shape, of the leaves, of the flowers, the color of the plant, and you can even get these kind of changes, within the same sour diesel plant or within the same cherry chem plant. And so another thing that Kevin Jodrey talks about is how he actually selects plants for their chemotype. Chemotype essentially being a type of phenotype. He selects plants for this, not for their genetic makeup, but for the expressed characteristics, especially of the chemistry, the cannabinoid percentages and the terpenes the plant expresses. And that's how he selects for genetics. And if you don't know, Kevin Jodrey is one of the most prolific, well-known, established breeders of cannabis in the country. He runs the first ever cannabis nursery in Humboldt called Wonderland Nursery. And so here's just those same cannabis genotypes and phenotypes now listed out. We've got different indica dominant, sativa dominant, pure sativas, and there's an aromatic description to go with it. And then you can also see the lineage, where these things originated from. Now, the lineage of the plant can be interesting. If you know where the plant originated from, you can actually make a good guess as to the climate that it's most suited for. The Afghani lineage, for example, that you see for the blackberry Kush, Afghani Kush, means that it actually came from the Kush Mountains region of Afghanistan. And so if you look up what the climate is of that region, you can get a sense of what climate is most appropriate for that particular cultivar. And so this brings us to the topic of land races, which is really the origin of a particular cannabis cultivar, or any cultivar really, where it originates from as a wild species. So cannabis has evolved and grown really in many different climates all over the planet. There's speculation that it started from India or Southeast Asia, but we know that throughout human history there's been cannabis plants growing in many different climates around the world. And it's probably took about 10,000 years or so for those wild species to be cultivated and taken in by humans. And those original species that were domesticated by humans are what's known as the land races. So those are kind of like the pure species. And then from there, breeders took them and started to cross them with different genetics. And so that's what we've gotten over decades, over the last several decades. We've gotten all these different cultivars that are crosses of different land-race genetics. And now today we're getting even more sophisticated with breeding different strains and also homogenizing them more. Most growers want to get strains that are relatively homogenized, and so we're getting even more high-tech in our breeding. Now we've got tissue culture, which we'll talk a little bit later, and we are having more and more of an influence on those genetics. But there are some people that want to try and move back to these landrace genetics and try to grow plants that are best suited for their region, and even to develop what's called a terroir, or an appellation for cannabis, meaning that there are particular species, just like wine grapes. For example, Bordeaux. Bordeaux is a grape that's from a particular region in France, and the characteristics of the soil in that region, the climate, all work together with that variety to give it the flavor that it has. And so there's a group of people that want to do this for cannabis too, and say, hey, these particular varieties are best suited to these climates and these regions, and we're going to label them as such so that people know where they came from and they have an idea of what flavor to expect, because the soil and the climate of a particular region will again influence the phenotypes, how that plant expresses itself, and it's going to influence the flavor profile of that plant. This is all an evolving area of cannabis, but it's an important consideration if you're planning a commercial grow. So a little bit more on the different cannabis phenotypes. We've got these different varieties: sativa, indica, ruderalis, and hybrids, of course. You've probably heard mostly about sativa and indica. These are largely the two different phenotypes of cannabis. Now there's a lot of question of, are these different species of cannabis? Do they have different effects? Well, what's the difference between these two? Most people know them by the effects that they have, either like a social high or a more relaxed high. But really what the difference is between sativa and indica is actually about their origin and just about, again, the phenotypical expression of the plant. As you can see here, indica plants typically have larger, fatter leaves, whereas sativas have longer, skinnier leaves. Same thing with the shape of the plant. The sativa plant itself tends to be taller and more stocky, whereas an indica plant is short and bushy. The Ruderellus plant is what's also known as an autoflower variety, and until recently, Ruderellus or autoflower has been somewhat discounted in the industry, but those genetics are starting to improve from what I've been told, and actually are starting to even rival sativas and indicas. But again, really what this is about is the origin, the shape of the leaf, the plant size, also the time until flower. Indica plants tend to have a shorter maturation period, and so there's a preference for those often in indoor growing settings where the turnaround is a lot quicker. And of course the photo period. As we know, a Ruderellus or an autoflower actually flowers based on a period of time rather than differences in the lighting, as is the case with sativa and indica. The plant will switch into flower based on the hours of light in the day for sativa and indica. And then of course a hybrid can be a cross between any one of these. And to finish up with the discussion of phenotypes, we'll talk a little bit about the chemotypes. So the biggest difference in chemotypes these days is really between CBD and THC varieties. Now some people are starting to get a little confused and say, oh, well, we've got hemp and we've got cannabis, and they're actually two different species of plant. One produces CBD, one produces THC. This is a little bit up for debate here as to whether these are the same species. Some would argue that because they can be crossbred, they can breed with each other, they are actually different varieties of the same species. But some people argue that they are different enough that they should be called different species. Really, what this comes down to these days is the legal definition. So the federal definition of cannabis versus hemp is hemp has to have less than 0.3% THC, as you probably know. So that's really just a legal distinction. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are two different species, but that is how the government is currently defining it. You could, though, have a high CBD, low THC species that is intended to express 0.2% THC, and because of different climate conditions, climate factors, it actually ends up expressing a higher percentage of THC. And now you've gotten into the cannabis category and you're potentially going to be in trouble with the authorities, but that's the same plant that is now producing a higher amount of THC. So is that a different species? Again, this is up for debate. Just one example of how the environment can influence the percentage of THC or CBD is that it's been found through experiments that in a drought-stressed environment, in other words, an environment that is hot and dry and where the plant is actually lacking water, gets drought-stressed, this will increase the percentage of THC. So that's great. If you're growing cannabis for THC, you can increase your THC percentage that way. But if you're growing CBD, you might accidentally end up testing hot because of your hot, dry climate. So again, climate and environment play an important role here. All right, so now let's talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of seeds, clones, and then we'll also talk about tissue culture and starts. So seeds versus clones is the typical decision for a cannabis grower. These are really the two main options that people tend to choose. The advantages with starting from seed is that you typically are going to get a stronger plant because the seed can have a taproot. The cannabis or hemp plant is famous for having a really big, deep taproot that goes deep into the ground, and this means it's great for regenerating the soil, and it also means that plant can get really strong and established. Clones don't have that taproot, so you're just not going to have as strong a plant if you choose clones. Also, if you're growing from seed, you can control the growing environment from the very beginning, and so you don't have to worry about bringing in disease or about how that clone was cultivated, what types of chemicals might have been used on it. Now, the disadvantage of seeds is that you're going to have more phenotypical variation between seeds. So you're going to get more different sizes of plants. Seeds are going to produce sibling plants, so you may even get slightly different phenotypical expression of those plants. So they may mature at different rates, and they're potentially going to look a little different. It's also harder to tell the quality of a seed, although towards the end of this lesson we will talk about how you can judge the quality of a seed. Now, the advantage of clones is that they're very uniform. Your plants are going to be practically the same size, mature at the same speed, and it's going to be very easy to keep track of them that way. It also means less time to maturity. So especially if you're a commercial grower, commercial growers tend to choose clones just because of that quicker grow cycle. Although again, with clones, disadvantage is that it's easier to bring in diseases that way, and they are a little bit higher cost than seeds. Now here's your two other options, starts and tissue culture. Starts are not as typically used in cannabis, but this is very common for growing different fruits and vegetables. A start kind of has some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages of both seeds and clones. So with a start, you are going to have a stronger plant in cannabis with a taproot because it's ultimately come from a seed. But you're also, just like a clone, you're going to have less grow time because you've got a plant started already. You are still going to have the same kind of phenotypical differentiation, different expression that you get from a seed, so not quite as uniform. And starts can also carry disease from wherever they were started, and they also are a little bit higher cost than seeds. Now, tissue culture, this is a relatively new and more advanced method that is actually used in cultivating a lot of plants around the world, and it's just starting to make its way into cannabis now. There's a lot of advantages, or at least supposed advantages, of tissue culture. Plants from tissue culture are going to be uniform, just like clones, and they're going to have less grow time, just like clones. But the big advantage of tissue culture is that supposedly you're not going to get the same kind of disease problems that you can get from clones. This is really the promise of most tissue culture companies. However, with tissue culture, you've got to consider that it's still not going to be quite as strong as a seed and not have that taproot, because this is a process, this is an artificial process where you're taking the tissue of a plant and you're growing a plant out of that. So you're not going from a seed, therefore you're not going to have a taproot and not quite as strong a plant. So how do you decide where you're going to get your genetics from, especially if you're sourcing clones or starts? Seeds are a little bit easier. There's ways to tell if you have quality seeds, and you can get them from a lot of places. But if you're getting clones or starts, you're going to want to consider carefully who the breeder is, or who the nursery is, who's behind the nursery, and where these are coming from. You want to really try to look at a track record, see somebody that has an established track record of success. Especially talk to other growers about them, other growers who have used them and the experience that they had. This probably goes without saying, but go with somebody who has a reputation for quality. Even if they're a little bit more expensive, it's going to probably cost you a lot more money in the longer term to try and fix a problem of bad genetics than to go for quality genetics in the first place. We always encourage leaning towards organic. If somebody is certified organic cultivating, that just means you're going to get a higher level of quality. Even though organic is not everything, as we know, you're still probably going to get a higher level of quality that way. And don't follow the hype. So especially in cannabis, there is a lot of hype oftentimes around new breeders, new hot breeders with hot strains, and everybody's trying to get this particular strain. Well, if you think about it, if you are growing commercially, if everyone's trying to get that same strain, then everyone's going to have the same product, and how are you going to differentiate your product in the marketplace? So I would say it's actually better to go for, and honestly the smart growers will go for a strain that is not the hot strain that year. Also, unfortunately, genetics that are hyped can tend to be lower quality and have diseases carried with them. So stay away from the hype. Even if somebody has won a growing competition, a breeding competition, look at that competition. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have the best genetics. There's a lot of factors that go into those competitions, and unfortunately in some of them there's probably some insider trading, so to speak. But there are some established competitions like the Emerald Cup that have been around for a long time, have a reputation for quality, and so those are probably going to be good strains to go with. I mentioned Kevin Jodrey earlier and Wonderland Nursery, one of the oldest cannabis nurseries, in fact the oldest cannabis nursery in the United States, has a reputation for quality. Kevin Jodrey grows with living soil, and so you know you're going to get good genetics there. And there are others out there too. And so finally, what are our considerations for high bricks growing? What are we thinking about a little bit differently that other people may not be thinking about as much? Well, for one, we put more emphasis on having really strong plants. As you know, having a strong, healthy plant is what's going to give you the best chance of getting high bricks and getting above that threshold where pests are no longer going to attack your plant. So, as we talked about, the way to get the strongest plant is by seed. And this may be unpopular for some commercial growers to hear, but you really are going to get a stronger plant from starting from seed, even though it takes longer and involves more work. If you're a home grower, on the other hand, the decision to start from seed should be pretty easy. That's what I always do. I always start from seed. You've got less plants to deal with, so you can give them the individual care that they need. You can spend a little bit longer time growing, and it's going to be worth it in the end. However, if you are going to grow from clones or from starts, again, look carefully at the source, where you're getting them from. Know how they raised them. If they've raised them using organic or even better living soil methods, then you're probably going to get a stronger, healthier clone anyway, and still give you a better chance of success. Or bring the cloning process in-house and use your same living soil for your mother plants and for your clones. It's been demonstrated that mother plants that are grown with living soil are actually more robust over time. They actually live longer lives being grown in living soil and will produce a lot more clones for you over time. And then again, always remember to try and match your genetics with your environment if you can. So if you're growing vegetables, grow vegetables that are suitable for your climate. You're probably not going to have a lot of success growing tomatoes in a climate where it rarely gets above 40 degrees at night in some of the more northern climates, because tomatoes really like warm climates. And if you can, find out from your cannabis breeder what climate your strain does the best in. Alright, finally we're going to talk about what to look for in a healthy cannabis seed. So these are the main things here. You really want to look to make sure the seed is not cracked, first of all. If the seed is cracked, it's probably not going to germinate. Probably means it already attempted to germinate and didn't go. You also want to make sure that the seed has a hard shell. You can squish it between your fingers, and if it squishes or cracks, then it's not a viable seed. It's either immature or it's too old. Make sure that it has a waxy coating and a slight sheen to it. It's another way you can tell a healthy seed. And then make sure that it's a dark color, so darker tan or brown or black is what you want to look for with a cannabis seed. If it's anything lighter than that, if it's like cream colored or white, that means the seeds were probably harvested immaturely and they're not going to sprout. This is just a helpful chart to look at the different varieties of cannabis seeds. As you can see, they come in many different shapes. As you can see, they come in many different shapes and sizes and even colors, but for the most part, they're all kind of in that darker tan, darker brown shade, and you can see the shape of them. So this is what you want to look for. And if you really want to ensure that your cannabis seeds, or actually any seed, is healthy, you can do what's called the float test. So all this means is you're just going to drop the seeds into water. Now you probably want to do this right before you're intending to germinate them, because once they get wet, they're going to start to germinate. But you drop them in a cup of water, and if they sink to the bottom, that means that they are still viable seeds and probably good to go. If they float, on the other hand, probably means that they're dead and they're not going to germinate. Now your germination rate for your seeds is important. You should have a 90+% germination rate. If you don't, that means that those seeds are pretty old, and even the ones that did germinate may not be as strong and robust as you'd like them to be. And you can test some of the seeds for germination, or you can just germinate them with this method. Paper towel, get the seed a little bit wet, put it in a paper towel. You want to cover it up to make sure it's in a dark place, and wait a few days for it to sprout. Open it up and check it, water it a little bit more if you need to. Make sure that paper towel stays really damp because it's water that's needed to germinate. But if you don't feel like you need to test ahead of time and have a visual on whether the seeds germinate, you can, and you're pretty confident, you can just put them directly into the soil. This is typically what I do with my seeds, is I don't wait for them to germinate outside. I just put them into the soil where they belong, surrounded by all that nice microbial life that they like, and start watering that soil. And within a week, they should start to sprout. If you do go with this external germination method, once the seed starts to sprout, what you'll see coming out is the taproot. And so when you place it in the soil, you want to make sure that taproot is facing down. Alright, so that's it for our genetics lesson, and that's it for part 1 for our fundamentals section. So now you've got all of this fundamental information that you need to move forward, and in the next lesson we're going to start to get a little bit more practical and talk about what are the materials that you need, how do you get your living soil started, what do you mix together, what are you going to add to your living soil, and how are you going to prime the soil to grow really great high brix plants. So we'll see you in the next lesson.